It was late evening again. Thomas was sitting on his worn sofa, nursing a mug of tea that had long since cooled. His apartment was small, but it had always felt just right for him. There was the little table in the corner, the shelves lined with slightly bent paperbacks, the aging but soft rug that kept his feet off the chill of the wooden floor. Outside his window, the street lamps cast yellow shapes across thin curtains, flickering slightly in a gentle breeze. Beyond that, the city murmur floated up, a taxi passing, a distant siren, but nothing sharp or alarming. For Thomas, evenings followed a quiet pattern. He'd finish work, walk home, warm something for dinner, and spend a bit of time in front of the TV. He didn't need much more. He had chosen this place exactly because it felt peaceful, maybe even a little insulated from the world. As a man pushing 40, quiet suited him. There was a certain level of comfort in knowing what came next. His nights, though, had started to feel different. For the past several evenings, when everything else grew still, he began to notice something. Most nights, after turning out the lights and settling into bed, he would lie there, fading into that light doze just before sleep. But then, faintly, from the hallway outside his bedroom, he'd hear footsteps. Slow, careful ones, almost as if someone didn't want to be caught. Each time, Thomas listened, first in confusion, then in annoyed disbelief. After all, nobody else lived in the apartment. No roommate. No pets. Nobody had a key but him. He brushed it off the first night, telling himself it was probably just the sound of a neighbor from the other side of the wall. These walls were thin. He'd heard someone's TV through the plaster before, and the pipes clanged every now and then. It could have been anything. But the next night, he heard it again. Not through the wall this time. It was clearly, unmistakably, footsteps on his own wooden hallway just outside his door. 5 steps, always slow, then nothing. Then, a long silence. He never heard footsteps leaving, just arriving. After several nights, it became a part of his thinking. He wondered if it was some strange echo from the building. Maybe footsteps from the level above, bouncing oddly downward. Maybe some trick of acoustics. He started spending a minute every evening just standing in the hallway, listening, before brushing his teeth. The hallway always felt empty, and the only sound he could find was the tick of the thermostat. He would lock his front door, double-check the windows, switch off the kitchen light, and climb into bed, pulling the covers up just under his chin. But always, as the lights outside his window darkened, he'd hear it, the soft, hesitant tap of feet. Tonight started no differently. Thomas took a warm shower, savoring the feeling of water against his skin, letting his thoughts drift. After, he pulled on his oldest pajamas, a deep blue pair that had faded around the seams. With his tea cooling beside him on the nightstand, he flipped through the television channels, settling on an old movie he mostly remembered. The apartment was quiet, only the glow of the screen filling the living room. Every so often, he glanced at the clock. 11:15, 11:30. Quiet hours. Eventually, he sighed, stretched, and went to the kitchen to turn off the last light. He stood in the narrow hallway, the length of it barely 10 feet, staring at the closed door to his bedroom. He always felt a little hesitant, though he couldn't say why. It was just a hallway, surrounded by locked doors. Still, The silence in the hall seemed a little thicker than the rest of the apartment. He turned the bedroom handle and stepped inside. He placed his phone on the side table, then checked the window lock as always. Everything was just as it should be. He slid into bed, arranging the pillow, pulling the soft blanket around his shoulders. He closed his eyes and listened to the hum of the heater in the corner. The world outside seemed soft and far away. Minutes passed. Soon, that deep quiet settled, the kind that comes before sleep. No cars, no voices through the walls. Thomas drifted, loose thoughts flickering one after another, a bit of work he'd left unfinished, an email he should send tomorrow, a funny thought about a childhood friend. His breathing slowed and he felt himself slipping toward sleep. That's when the footsteps began. The sound was subtle, so quiet that you might not even notice it if you weren't listening for it. A single creak, careful and slow, right outside his bedroom door. Then another. 4, 5 deliberate steps, paced out like someone not wanting to disturb. Thomas opened his eyes in the darkness. He tried not to move, barely letting himself breathe. His heart thumped, but he reminded himself it was probably nothing. The building was old. Old places make noise, he told himself. But these sounds were different. There was a small pause, a soft click, like the shift of someone standing and waiting. But no knock, no call, no other movement. Just silence. He tried to listen for footsteps going away, but none came. Thomas stayed there, eyes open, staring at the shadows in his own room. Maybe this was his mind playing tricks on him. He reached for his phone, tempting himself to check the time, but didn't want the blue light to break the calm of the room. He stayed, still, not wanting to move, not wanting to disturb anything. After a few minutes, only the building's silence greeted him. He let out a slow breath. He listened again, but nothing came, not a step, not a whisper. The footsteps had stopped. Thomas told himself he would check the hall in the morning. He let his eyes close, feeling strangely tired now. There was no reason to be afraid. He was alone, and the door was locked. He turned over and drifted toward sleep. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. He woke to soft light from the window, blinking against the morning sun. Work was waiting. He moved through his morning routine, but every so often, he glanced at the hallway as he passed. It looked just the same as always, the creaky boards and slightly crooked pictures on the wall. Thomas told himself he probably just needed to get more sleep. A night of rest always made things seem normal again. He poured himself a cup of coffee, took a shower, and tried to put the whole thing out of his mind. After work, as the sky faded again and evening came, Thomas found himself avoiding the hallway a little longer than usual. But he told himself everything was quiet, calm, as always. He looked around the apartment, checking every door and window out of habit, finding them all locked as usual. He brushed his teeth, washed his hands, and stood in the hallway for a while, telling himself to listen. But all he heard was the soft patter of rain on the glass. Maybe tonight would be quieter. In that little apartment, Thomas let himself believe in safety. He got into bed earlier, told himself there was nothing more to worry about, and when his eyes closed, he told himself the footsteps were just his imagination. But deep down, some part of him kept listening for the next night. The days went by, quiet and methodical, as Thomas tried to convince himself it was nothing. He kept his routine even more carefully than before. He left for work each morning as always, coat zipped high, bag slung over one shoulder, nodded to the same neighbor he passed on the stairs, bought a coffee from the same cart at the corner. In the evenings he returned home, passing through the familiar lobby and letting himself in with the scraped brass key he'd had for years. The apartment felt safe by day, filled with weak winter light and the scent of old paper. Sometimes he'd open a window just to smell the cool air outside, letting the city noise drift in for a while before closing it against the growing dusk. He kept busy, straightening the books on his shelves, making dinner, running a load of laundry even though he only had a few things. But always, as night drew in, he found himself growing restless, as if he was waiting for something. He'd taken to lingering in the kitchen, standing with his arms crossed, pretending to scroll through his phone a little longer than before. When it was finally time to get ready for bed, he moved through the apartment slowly, flicking off lights and securing the locks with automatic precision. He stood in the hallway, staring at the door to his bedroom, reminding himself how silly it was to feel this way. The hallway looked harmless in the glow of the ceiling light, just a narrow space, nothing more. There were the familiar marks on the wall from where he'd carried in a large box years ago. There was the low cabinet where he kept spare towels. But when he turned off the light, the hallway seemed to fold in on itself, as if the darkness made it smaller and longer at the same time. He tried to go to bed early, hoping tiredness would keep him from noticing anything. But sleep didn't come easily. He couldn't help but notice the patterns. The footsteps always came at the same time, somewhere between midnight and 1 in the morning. Always 5 steps, always slow. No more, no less. Never retreating. No door opening or closing. Once he tried to stay awake, lying perfectly still as the hours ticked by. When the city outside was completely quiet, there it was again. A gentle, weighty step, boards creaking softly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He sat up in bed, staring at the door. Silence returned. He waited, not daring to move, just listening. If he focused, his own breathing seemed loud enough to drown out anything else. The silence was heavy, pressing in on his thoughts. He thought about opening the bedroom door, even reaching for the handle a few times. But every time, something stopped him. Maybe he didn't want to see that it was just empty space, or maybe he didn't want to prove himself right about hearing something that shouldn't be there. He reminded himself that he lived alone, that there was no way someone could be out there unless they'd come through a locked door. He checked the windows again every night, and each time they were sealed tight, the locks untouched. By the third night, a pattern had taken hold. He'd lie awake in bed, waiting for the sound, certain he would hear it again. Each night, the footsteps came, never varying, always 5 slow steps, always stopping just outside his door. During the day, Thomas wrestled quietly with the thought of telling someone. But what was there to say? That he heard footsteps in his own hallway every night. He could imagine how that would sound to a friend or coworker. Like someone who was letting old fears get the best of him. He even thought about asking the landlord if anyone else had noticed odd sounds, but every time he tried to bring it up, the words died on his tongue. He didn't want to seem strange. So, he kept it to himself. He convinced himself he was just tired. But then there were other, smaller details, things he couldn't explain away so easily. One morning, he found the picture frame in the hallway, the one with a faded photo of his parents, tilted slightly off-center. He always kept it straight. Another night, he found the tap in the bathroom running, just a trickle. He was sure he'd turned it off tightly before bed. A towel he kept on the rack was damp though he hadn't used it. All small things, but enough to make him wonder. Still, he told himself there was probably an explanation. Maybe he bumped the picture frame walking by. Maybe he hadn't tightened the tap enough. The days stacked up in this way. Every evening, his anxiety grew as night approached. He tried to distract himself, calling old friends, reading until his eyes burned, watching television with the volume turned higher than usual. But when the apartment finally grew quiet, and he found himself alone with nothing but his thoughts, the pattern resumed. In bed, he listened, waiting for the steps. He tried to count time in his head, measuring the distance between the sounds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence. He listened for the sounds of the city outside, but found none. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world was waiting for something too. Some nights he dreamt of the hallway, but the dreams faded as soon as he woke, leaving only a lingering feeling of unease. He began to feel watched, not only at night but in the dim hours of morning as well. When he stood in the hallway, he had the sensation of someone behind him. He would stand quietly, eyes fixed on the door at the end, the silence pressing in. He tried to laugh at himself, telling himself that all old buildings creak and settle. But when he closed his eyes at night, the footsteps always came. They were as sure as his own heartbeat. One evening, he tried to catch the sound in the act. He stood quietly behind his door, lights off, holding his breath. The hallway was completely silent. He waited until midnight, clutching his phone, telling himself he would record any sound he heard. But the moment he lay down, the footsteps started again. The same 5 steps, slow and measured. It was as if they only happened when he was most vulnerable, hidden from his own view. He tried moving his bed further from the door, telling himself it would help him sleep. The distance didn't change anything. The footsteps kept coming, 5 careful steps, always stopping just before his door. It was the routine now, his own pattern, running alongside the rest of his life. Every night, the fear nudged closer to his daily thoughts. He started checking the locks in the afternoon, long before dusk. He found himself glancing over his shoulder as he moved through the kitchen. When the mailman knocked in the morning, he jumped. He tried to comfort himself with familiar rituals. He made sure his shoes were lined up neatly by the door. He cleaned the apartment thoroughly, wiping every surface. He tried to fill his time, reading, writing, even taking up a jigsaw puzzle. But in bed, nothing helped. The footsteps were patient. They always waited until night wrapped tightly around his apartment. Thomas knew he was losing sleep. His limbs felt heavy in the mornings, and his mind wandered at work. Some days, he found himself staring at nothing for minutes at a time, mind drifting to the sound of steps on wood. He wondered if the sound would stop if he ignored it, but it never did. It was always there, quiet, almost respectful, and somehow relentless. He tried to remind himself this was just a house, wood and plaster, brick and paint. But as night deepened, he was never fully convinced. He walked the length of the hallway one night, pressing his bare feet against each floorboard, looking for places that might creak. But none of the boards felt loose, and the sound was different when he did it, lighter, less deliberate. He tried walking with the same slow pace, but it never sounded the same. He went to bed that night with the lamp on beside him, the soft glow casting long shadows on the wall. He told himself he'd only rest a little and then check the hallway again. But when the footsteps came, right on time, the lamp's light seemed to grow weaker. Thomas stared across the room, and for a moment, he thought he saw. The door cast a longer shadow, not moving, but somehow thicker than before. The steps never came closer, never tried the handle, never retreated. Just stopped outside, listening, waiting. He didn't move, not wanting to invite anything more. He stayed awake most of that night, eyes wide, telling himself it would end. But morning always broke the spell, and everything went back to normal. The hallway was just a hallway again, full of soft light, safe and empty. So Thomas kept moving through his days, doing everything he could to keep the feelings at bay. But every night, as he lay there in the thick silence, he knew the footsteps would come again, always the same. As the days blurred together, Thomas found himself wandering his apartment with unfamiliar caution. Mornings felt heavier, he often woke exhausted, mind foggy, limbs slow to move. Nights were even slower, each minute stretching out. He became aware of details he'd never noticed before, the faint scent of dust in the hallway, the soft click of pipes cooling, the way light seeped through the cracks around his bedroom door. His world had shrunk down to these simple, repeating details. But with each passing night, everything felt a little less certain. He started to stay up later, as if waiting made things safer. Sometimes he'd keep the television on even after midnight, letting familiar voices fill the spaces between rooms. But the longer he waited, the more anxious he felt, like he was inviting the footsteps by acknowledging them. He stopped cleaning up after dinner, leaving dishes to pile in the sink, as if avoiding his routines could break the pattern. But the footsteps never changed. One long night, as he sat in bed, book closed and lights dim, he heard the familiar sequence, 5 steps, slow and careful. But this time, when the silence fell, it felt sharper. As if something was waiting for him to respond. He lay still, hand on the blanket, heart beating slowly but heavily. He listened, tried to slow his breathing, tried to focus on anything else. The footsteps didn't come again, but the tension stayed, drawn out like a wire through the quiet. After that, the small oddities increased. He would find his kitchen light turned on in the morning, though he remembered turning it off. Once, he found the salt shaker on the floor. His coat, usually hanging by the door, had fallen during the night, swaying slightly as if someone had just brushed past. There was no sign of a break-in, no marks on the locks or windows. Thomas even called a locksmith to check the front door. The professional reassured him everything was working as it should. The locks were sturdy, untouched. Thomas almost wanted something to be wrong, an explanation for the unease that grew each night. He began to question his own memory. Did he forget to turn off the light? Had something fallen by itself, or was he slipping somehow? During the day, he tried to distract himself. He went for walks longer than before, sometimes in the cold rain, just to feel something different. He called an old friend, talked about nothing important, just to hear another voice. He didn't tell anyone about the footsteps. He tried to convince himself he could change things by changing his routine. One night, he slept on the sofa in the living room, telling himself the noise was just tied to his bedroom. But at midnight, the footsteps sounded from the hallway just the same, steady, moving past the living room door, pausing, then vanishing. Sleep became a complicated thing. Each evening, Thomas would close all the doors in the apartment except the bedroom. He would make a point of locking them, as if this could keep uncertainty out. He tried sleeping with music, but the melodies seemed to thin out in the early hours, overpowered by silence. His dreams grew strange, he couldn't remember the details, but always woke with the feeling of being watched from a doorway just out of sight. Some nights, half awake, he would think he heard quiet breathing in the hallway, or the faint brush of cloth against plaster. But every time he checked, there was nothing there. It was on a particularly still night that everything seemed to press in at once. Thomas lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, watching a faint patch of city light flicker along the plaster. The air was cold. He could barely hear the heater working in the corner. He tried counting seconds, measuring the distance to sleep. The footsteps were late that night. He caught himself wishing for them, anything was better than the heavy anticipation. Finally, they came, 5 slow, deliberate steps, closer than ever. They stopped right outside his door. But this time, in the silence that followed, Thomas heard something else, the faintest sound of someone's breath, slow and deep, just beyond the thin wood. He froze. He strained his ears, sure his heart would be loud enough to give him away. The breath continued for a long while, drawn in, let out, as steady as his own fear. He felt a tingling across his skin, goosebumps rising in the cold air. The quiet was thick, almost physical. Finally, the breathing stopped. There was no retreating step, no sound of movement. Just silence, more complete than before. Morning came, and Thomas felt stranger than ever. He moved through his day with a numb sort of detachment, barely registering meetings at work, drifting through the grocery store like a ghost. When he arrived home, the apartment seemed different. The photos on the wall all seemed just a little crooked. One window, newly dusted, had a handprint. He stared at it for a long time, telling himself he must have left it there himself somehow. Except, it was too large, the fingers too long. He wiped it away, refusing to look again. He thought about calling someone, maybe a friend, maybe the police. But what would he say? That something unseen left footprints and handprints. That every night, a pattern repeated. He felt isolated, trapped by his own awareness. It was as if the boundaries of his home and his thoughts had collapsed together. He stopped watching television. The constant company of voices made him uneasy, like he was being watched through the screen. The quiet felt more honest, even though it made the nights sharper. That night he decided to try something new. He moved the bedroom chair right up against the door, blocking it with his weight. He pressed his back to the door, knees up to his chest, breathing slowly. The room was so dark it was hard to tell if his eyes were open or closed. He waited. The world held its breath with him. At some point, the footsteps came. 5 slow, heavy steps in the hallway. Then nothing. But now, Thomas could feel something different, a faint vibration against the wood, as if someone was gently leaning on the other side. He pressed his palm against the door, feeling a coldness seep through, something real and distant at once. For a split second, he was sure he felt, a matching hand pressing back against his. He jerked his hand away, shivering, unable to think clearly. The silence grew deeper. No breathing, no shift of weight, just the strange certainty of being close to something unknown. Eventually Thomas, shivering, climbed into bed, leaving the light on. He listened for hours, but nothing else came. Only when dawn crept in did the sense of pressure fade. He drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams full of endless, echoing hallways, doors that opened onto more doors, never quite reaching the end. The next few days blurred together. Thomas barely spoke to anyone, paying attention instead to every detail in the apartment. He noticed new things, a faint scratch by the doorframe, a barely audible hum at midnight, the way the air in the hallway always felt colder than the rest of the apartment, even with the door closed. The footsteps remained, as sure and calm as ever. 5 steps. Always stopping. Always waiting. The world outside faded as his own hallway took over his thoughts, the sense of being watched growing close and familiar. He knew, deep down, that something in his reality had shifted. The footsteps were no longer simply strange sounds in the night. They had become an anchor, unsettling, constant, and quietly, terribly real. Thomas's world had narrowed to the length of his hallway. Every evening, as dusk faded and the noises outside dropped away, his apartment seemed to grow smaller. He moved quietly from room to room, barely making a sound, as if trying not to disturb whatever might be listening. His face had grown pale, his eyes ringed dark with restless sleep. The footsteps were no longer an interruption. They were an expectation, a quiet part of the night's routine, as steady as the dark itself. He stopped leaving the apartment unless he absolutely had to. Food delivered replaced trips to the market. On the days when he managed to step outside, the world beyond the front door seemed strange, muffled, and too bright. Whenever he returned, he felt a heavy relief, as if something had been waiting for him in the quiet of his home. There was comfort in the ritual, even as it became more isolating. He started talking aloud to himself, whispering things like, "Just another night," or, "You're here, you're alone, there's nothing there." Silence answered him every time. His routines now revolved wholly around preparing for each night. He inspected each lock twice, sometimes 3 times. He measured the hallway with his steps, counted out the boards, avoiding the third one that creaked in a sharper way. After dinner, he would tidy the rooms, put away any loose objects, check that the windows were sealed. When it was finally time to sleep, he would linger in the hallway, listening to the stillness, holding his breath. Then he would slip into the bedroom, close the door softly, and sit on the edge of his bed, listening for the first sign of movement. Without the distraction of work, Thomas grew more attuned to the changes in the apartment's atmosphere. The air seemed heavier at night, cooler, sometimes thick enough to almost taste. He began to notice faint sounds he'd ignored before, a half-caught whisper in the walls, the scrape of something moving across the floor far away. He told himself these were just tricks of the mind. Sometimes, he nearly convinced himself. Each night, the footsteps arrived right on time. 5 slow, measured steps. Always stopping just outside the door. For a long time, he dared not move. He listened, barely breathing, body stiff with anticipation. Nothing followed. No voice, no knock, just the quiet assurance that someone, or something, stood on the other side. Some nights, he heard the faint creak of weight shifting, the barely there sound of breath drawn in, let out. The silence afterward grew impossibly deep, as though the very air pressed in all around. He stopped opening the door. Something told him not to. It felt as if whatever waited out there expected him, patiently. The idea of seeing the shape that made the footsteps, of naming the presence lingering outside, filled him with cold dread. So, he waited out each night, sometimes falling asleep out of sheer exhaustion, waking to pale morning light and the soft comfort of a world restored, if only for a few hours. But even in daylight, the feeling never fully left. He would walk the hallway with his coffee, stopping to press his hand flat against the door. Sometimes he thought he could still feel the echo of another presence, something cold, distant, and unmistakably interested in him. He traced the scratches on the frame, the marks that hadn't been there months ago. He tried to remember if the hallway always seemed this long. Some mornings, he felt lost as he moved from bedroom to kitchen, as if passing through a space he didn't fully recognize anymore. The changes were subtle. The photograph in the hallway now showed a faint blur where his parents' faces should have been, though he was sure it had always been clear before. The pattern on the wallpaper seemed to shift each day, little vines creeping further across the plaster. He sometimes lost track of time, hours vanished, and he'd find himself standing in the darkness with no memory of how he'd gotten there. When he called friends, his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Distant, echoey, not quite his. They told him to sleep more, to go out, to take care of himself. But none of them could understand the simple, impossible reality Thomas now faced. One night, as rain tapped softly against the window, Thomas lay in bed, waiting. He had stopped resisting the sensation of being watched, accepting it as part of the darkness. When the familiar footsteps came, he let his eyes close, focusing on the rhythm, letting it wash over him. But instead of stopping at the door, this time the footsteps paused halfway down the hallway. Several minutes passed in silence. Then, slowly, a single additional step sounded, bringing the presence just that much nearer. It had never happened before. The routine was broken. Thomas's chest tightened. His breathing slowed. He listened, but there was nothing else, no voice, no movement, just the sense of something closer now. He didn't move from his bed. He didn't dare. The air grew colder, every sound in the apartment muffled under a strange pressure. He waited, eyes open, heart fading to a dull thud. Finally, after what felt like hours, morning light began to seep in around the curtains. The night passed without another sound. When he rose and checked the hallway, it was the same as always. Ordinary. Untouched. The sense of something changed lingered with him, a cold residue on the walls. From that night on, the footsteps did not always stop at the same spot. Sometimes, they only made 3 steps. Sometimes 6. Sometimes, he heard the faintest trace of movement crossing back into the darkness, almost as if whatever made the sound had finally realized he was listening. The routine was gone, and with it, the illusion of safety Thomas had built around himself. The nights drew longer. Some evenings, he sat awake, staring at the door until dawn. Other nights, he lost time, waking in strange positions, curled up on the floor, or sitting in the hallway, back against the wall, memories of dreams flickering at the edge of his mind. He wondered if he'd ever really been alone. He wondered how long the footsteps had been there before he noticed. It ended as softly as it began. One last night, as Thomas waited in the darkness, no footsteps came. There was only stillness, deep and complete. The air of expectation had faded, leaving behind a cold emptiness, almost worse than before. The hallway stretched quiet and long, nothing moving. Thomas lay awake, listening for signs of life, for any hint of the presence he'd grown accustomed to. But there was nothing. In place of fear, there was a gentle unease, a quiet certainty that something had changed forever. He knew, as the birds outside began to chirp in the growing dawn, that the footsteps were gone. In their place was a silence that stretched on and on, filling the apartment with its soft, haunting echo. From then on, the nights were peaceful in their own way. But Thomas knew he would never truly be alone in the hallway again. The memory of those patient, expectant footsteps lingered in the air, a presence gone, but never forgotten. And so, each night, as he closed his eyes and waited for sleep, he listened, not for the footsteps, but for the quiet absence they left behind. And he realized, with a gentle chill, that sometimes what lingers in a quiet home is not what you hear, but what you never truly understand.